The first of them, of course, will be Professor Marko Pavlyshyn, and then thereafter we will have the Ambassador of the Republic of Poland to Australia, His Excellency Andrzej Wojciechowski, speaking after that. So first let me introduce Professor Marko Pavlyshyn. He is a very significant person for us, by the way, and we don't all of us to be around here today because of the contribution that he made jointly with Dr. Marko in establishing European Studies and the European Centre here at Monash University. So he is somebody that we value as our founding father, so to say. Professor Pavlyshyn is also a convener of Ukrainian Studies in the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics at Monash University, where he was also the head of School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics. He was the founding president of the Ukrainian Studies Association in Australia. In 1998, between 1998 and 2003, he was president of the Australian New Zealand Slavic Association. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. He's an author of several books and many other book chapters in journals that count up to 80. In his lecture on the EU, Russia, and the rest of Europe, he will provide a background of relationships between the EU and the European countries that are not members of the European Union. Among them is the Russian Federation, a major energy source for EU countries, but at the same time, a country on a course of political development that challenges European US political values at the same time. But European Neighbourhood Policy, or European Neighbourhood Policy also extends to other European countries. It's been the framework of the Eastern Partnership, which I mentioned to Marko. That's to countries such as Belarus, Moldova and Ukraine. So all those countries and the relationship they have with the EU will be covered because of today's lecture. So may I take this opportunity to welcome Professor.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Patrick, for that more than generous introduction. I'm honoured to share the floor today with Ambassador Jaroszynski, and I want to start my presentation to you with a statement of limitation and apology. Though I have a long association with the Centre for European Studies, I'm not myself a specialist in European Union studies. But what I have to say today are rather the observations of an interested bystander. And if you want the lowdown, if you want proper research into the questions that I'm going lightly to touch on today, then I suggest you have a look at some of the readings that I've put on the final slides of this PowerPoint presentation, which will be available to you through Blackboard. I understand that's the case, yeah? Okay. Well, what I'd like to do today is focus on the countries of Europe that aren't members of the EU and haven't ever been indeed on an accession timetable: the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. And if the Caucasus region is also included in our purview, then a few words need to be said about Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan as well. I ask what the objectives of the EU are towards these countries. How do these countries view their links to the EU? What's the nature of these links? And what are the major themes of the EU's relationship with these countries? in future. Yes. Oh well, you may have to just take notes, because this seems not to be advancing. Yeah, we are stuck. Well, I'm glad I brought this on paper as well. Now, if you had the map of Europe in front of you that you need to imagine at this stage, you'll be reminded that it's a very large place, and that something less than half of it is, in fact, within the orbit of the EU. That was... I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know, it just seems not to be very cooperative.
Not today. Not today. Not today.
Not today.
You're aware, of course, of the countries that were members of the EU after the expansion of 2004. I won't list them. There's a category of countries that have the status of candidate countries. It's Croatia, which is the closest to accession. It's to accede on the 1st of July next year. There's Turkey, which has been negotiating the process towards accession since 2005. There's the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, which has been a candidate since 2005. Montenegro since 2010, and Iceland since the same year. And then Serbia, which became a candidate on the 1st of March this year. And then there are certain potential candidate countries, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. But of course, there are, what if we try to get it straight from the USB? Yeah. There are, of course, several non-EU, not candidate and not potential candidate countries, which are rather significant in terms of their geopolitical clout, in terms of their population. The table that you'll be able to visit on Blackboard will show you that of a total population of about 450 million in the EU, well, in contrast to a total population of the EU of about 450 million, the Russian Federation, including the Russian Federation in Asia, has a population of about 143 million, and the next largest non-candidate country is Ukraine with 46 million, then Belarus getting towards 10 million. So these are not insignificant places. The countries of the Caucasus, of course, are rather smaller. Now, all of the places that I'm going to speak about today share an historical background. They'd all been part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Each one had been one of the 15 Union republics of the USSR. As you will be aware, from circa 1986, the Soviet Union embarked on a policy of liberalization under the leadership of the golden boy of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. And the slogans of glasnost, that's to say openness, perestroika, restructuring, and democratization, were catch cries for a process that had been intended by Gorbachev to liberalize, render more efficient and competitive the Soviet Union, in fact preserve its world power status, but in fact it opened the way to internal criticism, to focus on the crimes of the Communist Party. It opened the way to an open and much more open and free activity of the former satellite states of the Soviet Union. In all, led to the decline of the Soviet Union's power and its ultimate disintegration in 1991. It was 1991, 2 years after the fall of communism in Central and in the states of Central Europe. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. Now, one of the main motifs of the Gorbachev presidency of Russia and leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was his orientation towards Europe. You're probably familiar with his phrase, a common European home. And, I'll quote from that. We assign an overriding significance to the European course of our foreign policy. We are resolutely against the division of the continent into military blocs facing each other, against the accumulation of military arsenals in Europe, against everything that is the source of the threat of war. He said that in 1987. In his writings on the common European home, Gorbachev pointed to history. He pointed to the fact that all of Central and much of Eastern Europe had gone through the same key experiences in the cultural, social, historical overall evolution of Europe. All had shared to a greater or lesser extent in the Renaissance, in humanism, in the Reformation, in the Enlightenment, and then, of course, in the late 17th century, Tsar Peter I had subjected Russia itself to intense Europeanization, breaking through the window to Europe. Oh well, there we are. Yes. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that. Happiness comes to him who waits, yes? Okay. Right. This was the map that I wanted to show you with present members of the EU in yellow and the ones in the waiting room in purple, and those characteristically in grey who are not anywhere at all. Yes, we've said. Well, there you are. You see, I've caught myself out on an error. The EU population is not for 50 million, but rather more. Yeah. Okay, historical background, common European home. There we are. Now, the 80s and 90s had been marked by a reduction of the USSR control over the satellite states. As I said, the fall of the socialist regimes, 1989 in Central Europe, 91 the declarations of independence. This also signaled the end of the Cold War. That opposition between the West and the East, ushering in a complete change in what seemed to be the geopolitical opportunities of the countries in the east of Europe. Many of the former Soviet satellites began to look to the EU and NATO for their main economic, security and cultural partnerships. 2004, the major expansion of the EU, embracing several new states. 2007, the most recent expansion with Romania and Bulgaria joining. Now, what was there for the remaining European states? Well, there was a candidate and potential candidate status for some, but at the same time, as doubtless you'll be aware, the European Union is reluctant at the moment to contemplate further expansion beyond its 2007 borders, and there are probably several reasons for this. One of them is undoubtedly the fact that the Russian Federation, which has no interest in becoming an EU member, the Russian Federation has significant interests of its own in the region, and it is concerned about the prospect of all too close a relationship of some of its next door neighbours to the Western powers, certainly to NATO, but also to the EU. There's concern, very real and justified concern, about the political and economic readiness of the remaining states to be properly integrated into the EU, though these days I suspect some of those states are thinking that the EU is a club of which it's a good thing not to be a member. And then there's a kind of an internal concern about the kind of public skepticism within the core EU member countries about the value of a very large, expanded EU, and skepticism indeed about the EU itself. The poor showing of the referenda in France and Holland in 2005 is a symptom, I suppose, of this. Now, I'm sure that in previous lectures you will have learnt of the conditions of entry into the EU, the so-called Copenhagen criteria, established in 1993. And these conditions are a set of stable institutions to protect the rule of law, democracy, human rights, certain basic provisions for the protection of minorities, a functioning market economy, and the capacity to take on the responsibilities of membership, particularly adherence to the various practices and conventions of the EU. Now, in addition to that, there are the conditions set by the Madrid European Council of 1995, and that is that the candidate country must have created the conditions for its integration through the adjustment of its administrative structures, so that there is a kind of a correlation between these and those that prevail in the EU. Now, of course, the perspective of accession to the EU was a very, very significant factor in the politics and, if you like, in the social psychology of the countries of Central Europe that did in fact join in 2004 and 2007. And there were many in the countries which are not slated for accession who certainly for a time were profoundly disappointed with the fact that the EU was not contemplating extending the prospect of membership to them. And for these countries, that is is states which have a land or a sea border with the EU, and that includes states in Africa and the Middle East as well as Europe, there is a policy called the European Neighbourhood Policy, which has been in existence since 2004. And the objective of this policy is to help these states carry out certain reforms, particularly reforms that can be called democratization, to improve their capacity to integrate with the the European Union's market, to enable them to confront the environmental problems that the modern world as a whole faces, and to facilitate cooperation on a whole range of issues, energy, transport, migration, and so forth. And the method by which the neighbourhood policy approaches these objectives is by creating for each country an action plan. It's a bilateral plan between the EU and each individual country. And this is a map showing the European Neighbourhood Policy states in green. As you see, it's by no means a European club. Now, what is in these action plans? Well, there is above all the economic dimension. Their purpose is to foster economic cooperation and integration with EU and to free up market access. A second very significant objective is to manage the process of migration and to regulate the visa regimes of these neighbourhood states so that they actually advantage the EU. Not to put too fine a point upon it. Then many of these action plans profess the intention of addressing those conflicts that remain within and between the countries that are covered by the neighbourhood. There's been very little progress on some of these conflicts, for example, the Moldovan Transnistrian conflict that I'll return to later on. Then there's support for all sorts of reforms in that list of areas that you can see on the board. And there's the sphere of education as well. People-to-people exchange, particularly educationally based ones. There's also something called the Eastern Partnership, launched in 2009, which is just the European part of the European Neighbourhood Policy states. Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Now this, unlike the neighbourhood plan, which involves bilateral action plans, the Eastern Partnership is a kind of a multilateral way of addressing common issues. It's, again, yet another forum for discussing visas, trade, strategic partnerships. In other words, things to talk about while you're not being offered membership of the EU. Yeah. Now, the ambassador isn't hearing any of this, of course. Now, possibly the most important interlocutor of the EU on the European continent is the Russian Federation. Now, here's a potted sketch of the development of the RF since in 1991 it became the largest of the successor states of the USSR. under the presidency of the liberal, but perhaps excessively picturesque Boris Yeltsin, there was a genuine increase in citizens' freedom in the new RF. Economically, however, much of this democratization was undermined by vigorous and therefore socially very hurtful program of economic reform, sort of market-oriented reforms, shock therapy, leading to the extreme enrichment of a small number of people who are nowadays referred to as oligarchs and who wield very considerable economic and political influence, and ordinary people who were impoverished by these reforms. And it was also a period of, if you like, a weakened state enabling the proliferation of crime and corruption. Then we had the subsequent period, which begins in 2000 and proceeds really without much change until today, the kind of Putin act with a Medvedev interlude, if you like. I have to share with you a little joke concerning the alternation of leaders of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russian Federation. The basic principle of historical progress in this part of the world is the alternation between smooth men and hairy men. Right? So Nicholas II was hairy, Lenin was smooth. Right? Stalin was hairy, Khrushchev was smooth. After that, we had, where are we up to? Khrushchev. Brezhnev was extremely hairy all over his face. And he was followed by Gorbachev, who was bald, so bald that you could see the birthmark. We skipped Andropov and Chernenko because I can never remember the order in which they came, but I assure you one was hairy, the other smooth. And then we have now, after Gorbachev, the hairy Boris Yeltsin, followed by the smooth Putin. And the particular caricature that I saw yesterday showed the continuing progression of this series. The smooth Putin, the hairy Medvedev, the smooth Putin, the hairy Medvedev, the smooth Putin, the hairy Medvedev, and so on. Right. I hope it doesn't happen that way. Anyway, the characteristics of the Putin presidency have been viewed by some as a kind of a return to traditional concerns of Russian foreign policy and Russian identity and self-understanding since imperial days. So there's been a restoration of the idea of a firm state, rather disciplinarian state, and that has meant a certain amount of winding back of the democracy. Elections in the Russian Federation are not generally considered to be free and fair. There have been spectacular cases where the state has turned on alternative power sources, like the oligarch billionaire Khodorkovsky, who was imprisoned in 2005 and remains in prison. His term was extended as kind of an exemplary case showing what happens to you in the Russian Federation if you get out of line too much under the Putin presidency. For all of the importance of the oligarchs, the state has very firmly established its control over the key sectors of the economy, most particularly the oil and gas, which make the Russian Federation so wealthy at the moment. These oil and gas exports, in a significant measure to the European Union, stimulated economic growth. For the psychology of the Putin era, there's certain military exercises of the Russian state were very important. The successes against the insurgency in the North Caucasus, Chechnya. For all of the fact that these were very costly in terms of human life and suffering, they did boost a kind of sense that the state leadership was again able to do things and project the power of the state. 2008, of course, was yet another of these demonstrations, this time now of the capacity of the Russian Federation to project its will over over parts of what had been the Soviet Union, what some would consider the traditional sphere of influence of Russia. You probably remember the military confrontation in 2008 when Georgia tried to reassert its authority over the breakaway region of South Ossetia. What happened instead was that the Russian military intervened on the side of South Ossetia, and the outcome is that Georgia now has within its territory two regions over which it has no control, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both of which claim to be independent. They're client states of the Russian Federation. What the exercise did prove was that Georgia, which was a very vociferous ally of the United States, could not in fact rely on Western support to protect its interests. And I can see that I have reformed the spelling of the word prevent to leave only one vowel in it. That is clearly an improvement. Now, after 2008, of course, there could be no further talk of Georgia joining NATO, which had been an objective of Georgia, certainly, and an idea that the United States certainly had been taking seriously. Ukraine had also been interested not only in joining the EU, but under the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko, it had been interested in NATO membership as well. Well, these things ceased to be on the table from about 2008, and this is a measure of some of the success in international relations of the Russian Federation lately. The Russian Federation has taken on a role that puts itself in the forefront of international relations on the United Nations stage, and just now, in the context of the United Nations Security Council's attempts to restrain the activities of the Syrian government against its own citizens, for a long period, Russia, together with China, played the role of spoilers, resisting any resolution that would strive to limit that would strive to censure the Syrian government's actions. Just in recent days, of course, the Russian Federation has changed its mind and now has positioned itself as the power which is going to make possible a United Nations resolution on Syria. Now, one of the factors in Russian foreign policy is the presence of many people who speak Russian in neighboring countries. Some of those Russian-speaking people are ethnically Russian or designate themselves in censuses as ethnically Russian. And the Russian Federation has taken upon itself the right quite often to speak in defense or to claim to be supporting the interests of those Russian speakers or ethnic Russians in the so-called near abroad. This is another dimension of the resurgent Russian foreign policy. One factor within society that needs to be borne in mind is that this is all happening within the context of a resurgent Russian nationalism, especially among young people. There are numerous right-wing nationalist groups, of which possibly Nashi is the most notorious. Nashi means ours, you know, our folk, our people, we. The basic drift of these organizations is in favor of a restoration of Russian glory and power. And of course, this kind of social development matches the actual activity of the Russian state in the international arena. Now, Russia does not come under the European Neighbourhood Policy. Russian Federation EU relations are under an agreement, a partnership and cooperation agreement signed in '94 and covering a whole range of areas. Trade, of course, being important among them. There's a view that there are 4 common spaces of EU-Russia cooperation. These are external security, freedom, security and justice, economic, of course, and then science and education, including culture. Probably the most important fact about Russia as far as the EU is concerned is energy. The Russian Federation supplies a quarter of the EU's gas, and it's 42% of all of the gas that is imported into the EU. And for that reason, the EU regards Russia as a special strategic partner. Now, the EU, in contrast to the countries in the neighbourhood policy, the EU does not pursue the objective of having the Russian Federation adjust its laws to those of the EU. In other words, it doesn't strive to influence Russian internal affairs, whereas it explicitly does try to influence the internal affairs of the neighbourhood countries. This is a representation of the connections between the Russian Federation and Europe through pipelines, oil and gas pipelines. As you see, there's a network of them. They're a very significant fact in the economic realities of Europe. Now, the second largest non-EU, non-accession timetable countries is Ukraine, which geographically, but also some would say culturally and psychologically, is wedged between the European Union and the Russian Federation. And this position is reflected in some of the conflicting orientations in Ukraine's domestic politics. In the period from the Orange Revolution to 2010, under the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko, Ukrainian foreign policy was vociferously pro-EU and pro-NATO, but at the same time, relations with the Russian Federation were cultivated. Under the current president, Viktor Yanukovych, the emphasis is on he, certainly at the time of his election, Yanukovych presented himself as pro-Russian, but his government has also continued to resort to pro-EU rhetoric. So seemingly antithetical political leaders in Ukraine have always, and this has been a constant of Ukrainian foreign policy, have always tried to balance between EU and Russian Federation. And what has changed has been the emphasis. And the emphasis has changed largely with the domestic audience in mind. Now, Ukraine is of much less interest to the EU than is Russia, because it doesn't have oil and gas resources of its own, but it is a transit country. You will have seen on the map that some of the pipelines supplying the EU traverse Ukrainian territory, and the gas and oil can be switched on or off in Russia, but they can also be switched off in Ukraine, at least theoretically. Now, the EU policy towards Ukraine has been characterized, I suppose, by this kind of second-order level of interest. In Ukraine itself, the level of interest in the EU spiked in the early 2000s and peaked during the so-called Orange Revolution. In the early 2000s, the EU initiated programs in Ukraine encouraging the development of democratic practice, good governance, rule of law, market economy. But not at any stage was Ukraine offered the prospect of membership. Now, some here will recall the 2004 events when, objecting to a rigged presidential election, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of Ukrainian citizens massed, particularly in Kyiv, but in other cities as well, to protest against this infarction of essential political rights. And at that time, there was an expectation that this popular demonstration of attachment to democratic values would shift the perspective of EU policymakers in favor of ultimate Ukrainian membership. This didn't happen, in spite of significant rhetorical support for Ukrainian democracy by various European leaders at that time. So the consequence of this has been a kind of a gradual decline in public support for Ukraine's joining the EU. And that decline has been evident also among those who have been the greatest friends of Europe in Ukraine, the intellectuals, the Western-oriented intellectuals who know Europe and the West and who are keen to have their country integrated into Europe and the Western world. Officially, today, Ukraine continues to seek maximum integration with the EU, but certainly the warmth of this desire on the part of the present leadership is much less than that under the Yushchenko administration. Ukraine has an action plan with the EU. It emphasizes people-to-people contacts. It emphasizes a dialogue on education and training, and especially joining the Bologna process. In the 2000s, Ukraine did a lot to try to comply with neighbourhood policy standards. One of the outcomes of that was its ultimate joining in 2008 of the World Trade Organization. But one would have to say that today, the tendency of Ukrainians towards the West has been greatly dampened. And one of the kind of day-to-day factors that influence this is the very strict visa regime now that makes it extremely difficult for Ukrainian citizens to travel to the EU. And the borders of the EU have become very solid borders, almost like the Iron Curtain as far as ordinary people are concerned of the past, whereas the border between Russia and Ukraine continues to be open. So there's free travel between those two countries, and it's not possible to have that kind of arrangement without shifting popular perceptions of the relative place of a country in the world. Now, Ukraine, if you've been following the news, has had some pretty spectacular problems of late. The Yanukovych presidency has been seen, rightly I think, as winding back many of the democratic features that had set Ukraine apart from most of the post-Soviet states up to about 2010. Practically all power at federal and regional and even local level is now concentrated in one party, the Party of Regions, Yanukovych's party. The independence of the Ukrainian courts has now been demonstrated to be a sham. The leader of the opposition, Yulia Tymoshenko, was arrested and tried and now is in prison on grounds that are regarded by many as having been purely political and to exercise a demonstration effect, discouraging people from political opposition. The EU, to do it credit, has responded to this, and towards the end of last year, at the EU-Ukraine summit in Kiev, the EU pointedly refused to sign an agreement on association and free trade, making this dependent upon the release of Tymoshenko. Ukraine's small next-door neighbor between Ukraine and Romania is Moldova, independent in 1991, and immediately subject to an internal conflict. There's a breakaway region called Transnistria, which has de facto been independent since 1992. Russian Federation troops continue to be stationed in Transnistria. The country has Europe's lowest GDP per capita and has a serious crime problem. It does have an action plan with the EU. The action plan strives to enhance the strength of the state, essentially, to strengthen its administrative capacity. As do other action plans, it promotes respect for freedom of expression and media. It strives to involve the EU in the finding a solution for the conflict between Moldova and its breakaway region of Transnistria. The progress on that has been painfully slow over the decades. Moldova has expressed aspirations for EU membership, but these aren't likely to be realized anytime soon. Now, Belarus has been a little bit in the news of late because of its excellent tennis players, or should I say tennis player. But another figure that has brought the name of Belarus not into repute but disrepute is this man, Alexander Lukashenko, who has been president since 1994 and in many spheres of life has restored Soviet-era policies. Democratic institutions in Belarus, elections in Belarus are definitely far away from what a widely regarded as normal, far from what is normal democratic practice, and political opposition in Belarus is extremely difficult and is highly restricted. Very early in the piece, Lukashenko was an enthusiast of the idea of confederating with Russia to create a single state, but his relations with the Russian Federation have soured in recent years. Economically, Belarus, it has to be said, enjoyed a better economic shape than Ukraine, and in particular the prosperity of individual citizens of Belarus is relatively to their advantage. The average income in Belarus is much higher, for example, lower than in Russia, but much higher than in Ukraine. Now, the EU has taken a very dim view of Lukashenko. They've suspended assistance of various kinds, but have retained humanitarian aid. There's been a benchmarks approach since 2002, linking improvements in the democratic processes to deepening of relations with the EU. This hasn't had that much of an impact yet. Now, the elections that brought Lukashenko back in, well, he was in power, but he was re-elected in 2010. These elections were regarded widely as having been everything but free and fair, and the EU has intensified its restrictive measures against the country while increasing support for its civil society organizations. A little footnote here. I want to say that Belarus opposition activists have pioneered interesting new forms of protest using the new social media. So almost spontaneous meetings in public places are called by people appear, and they don't say anything, but they will clap together for a certain period of time, which is a kind of a symbolic expression of solidarity, even though no words are said that could be interpreted to have a political meaning. The Lukashenko government has clamped down on clapping in public. Now, Belarus is under the European Neighbourhood Policy, but there is no action plan currently in place. Now, I'm conscious of time. It's 5 to 1. I don't want to overburden you. I'll merely skip through those of my slides which refer to the countries of the Caucasus. Georgia, Georgia is looked upon as something of a positive example as far as democratic and economic development are concerned. There is a partnership and cooperation agreement and an action plan in place with Georgia. But on the other hand, Georgia has not really been able to capitalize on its favourable relationship with the EU in influencing its relationship with Russia. Very different is Azerbaijan. It's an oil-rich country with an authoritarian regime, but of very considerable interest to the EU because of its oil reserves in the Caspian Sea. And so the EU is interested in continuing its collaboration and deepening its cooperation with Azerbaijan, in particular in partnering Azerbaijan in the exploitation of further exploitation of Caspian Sea oil. Armenia has a partnership and cooperation agreement with the EU since 1999. Theoretically, it's a multi-party democracy, but it has been criticized often for its failure to hold free and fair elections. That of 2008, however, was viewed as relatively legitimate in contrast to what had gone before. Armenia has tense relations with two important neighbors, Turkey being one, and the tension there rests on Turkey's unwillingness to recognize the genocide, as a genocide, the genocide of Armenians in 1915, and there is tension with Azerbaijan over the ethnically Armenian, or majority ethnically Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh within Azerbaijan. The action plan in existence since 2006 also promotes democratization and human rights, and its socio-economic clauses favor reform and poverty alleviation. And the EU also wants to be involved in the peaceful resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute. Well, what can one say to conclude? Well, that the EU cultivates a special relationship with Russia, driven in large part by the necessity to secure its energy supplies. The EU is not really very capable of exerting influence on Russia or setting standards or norms for domestic policies which Russia would feel obliged to adhere to. The EU is not interested in expanding its membership to the neighbourhood policy states, but some of these, notably Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, have at different times wanted to be on an accession timetable, and because of that have at different times made adjustments of a greater or lesser kind to European EU requirements. But it has to be said that the absence of ultimate membership as a carrot dampens the influence of the EU in these countries. And a further factor dampening, well, in this instance dampening the interest of the non-EU countries in ultimate membership, is the are the economic problems that are being encountered by the EU itself today. I said that at the end of these slides there are a number of readings and recent publications on the neighbourhood policy, on the EU and the RF, and on the EU and some of the other countries that I've referred to today. And with that, I enter the black screen. Thanks very much for listening.